Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Clearly, much of our joy in life, the great zest for living, comes from these human relationships. But at the same time, we have to realize that it presents certain problems. Our human relationships often disappoint us greatly. That very often the people we are counting upon don't measure up in one way or another. We would like people to be there to encourage and help us in our down moments and when we're struggling with life. And sometimes we call upon our friends, or people turn to their spouses, and they simply aren't there.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Sister Pat Schnapp, an associate pastor at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of healing and human relationships. Here's Father Bacik.
Pat, I really enjoyed doing that course together on philosophy and literature, where we analyzed short stories in the light of the problem of evil and what the particular philosophers and theologians were saying about it. In fact, I think that method that we sort of stumbled on in the class, where we put up a dialogue between a particular theologian like Karl Barth and what a particular author like Joyce Carol Oates had to say, was really an effective one. And from my own viewpoint, one of the reasons for doing that was, as a theologian, I'm trying to always to get more in touch with what people are really experiencing and what people are going through in their lives, and to find the right kind of words and categories and phrases to describe very well the kinds of concerns that we humans have. And part of that, of course, is dealing with the problem of evil, or perhaps put in better terms, the problem of human suffering. One way of saying it is to try to delineate the faces of human suffering. How really do we experience that in our lives? And I think that course, I really learned a lot from that, and was most appreciative of you doing the literature side of that. And so I think maybe we could extend that conversation a bit. How did you end up feeling about that course yourself?
Oh, it was great fun. I think that so often in theology and philosophy, problems or themes such as evil are talked about in abstractions, and while that is perhaps necessary because of the nature of the discipline, I think in literature what we get is a concretization of those abstractions. We have evil, for instance, articulated through the metaphor of fiction. And so, for instance, instead of talking about evil, we have the interesting image in one of the stories we read of the buffalo calf, which was seized and sucked into the muck of the Nile. Or we have the picture of the Korean soldier who was probing with a rifle butt for another dead soldier wrapped in a plastic poncho with his eyes open. These are images that are very graphic and very concrete, and somehow I think we get more of a gut sense of what we're really talking about when we use this rather abstract concept of evil.
Yeah, I think I felt that happening in the class, and that very often I know the class discussion seemed to go better because there was this concrete thing to bounce off of, and that people could speak about a particular character and how they experienced the problem of suffering in their own lives. So I really believe that interplay between philosophy and literature seems to be a good one, and that as a theologian I really have to be alert to that. I really wish I sort of had more time to read fiction. I think it stirs the imagination and gives one a better language for preaching and teaching. And so teaching courses like that sort of moves me or forces me to work a little bit with the fiction writers. Now, in this particular session here, I would like to deal with one particular face of human suffering, and that is the suffering involved in our human relationships. Whereas I think right away we have to say that our human relationships provide us with our great joys in life, that they're through our interaction with other people that our spirits often soar and that we feel better about ourselves, that some of the times when people are close to us and we achieve some degree of intimacy, that we feel most liberated and free and more of ourselves, that the best of our human relationships are loving ones where we try to help each other to grow and so on. So clearly, much of our joy in life, the great zest for living, comes from these human relationships. But at the same time, we have to realize that it presents certain problems. Our human relationships often disappoint us greatly. that very often the people we are counting upon don't measure up in one way or another. We would like people to be there to encourage and help us in our down moments and when we're struggling with life. And sometimes we call upon our friends, or people turn to their spouses, and they simply aren't there. They're simply incapable of responding well. They've got their own problems, their own needs. They had only so much time and energy. And so there seems to be a disappointment built into human relationships. I think one of our great quests in life, as I often say, is for the ideal respondent, the perfect lover who will meet all of our needs. And yet, people constantly don't measure up to that, and all human interactions fail in one way or another. I'm reminded of that line, all things human given enough time go badly. Gustav Weigel's famous phrase, and I think that applies to human relationships probably as much as anything else. So we begin to get a feel here, perhaps, or a direction in this face of evil, that there's disappointment built into the human relationship. Do you want to stay with that for a moment before we try to go with that further, or you want to comment on that? Or
Only insofar as to say that our present century has been very concerned with trying to reflect just what you're talking about in a realistic manner, and to move away from the romantic notions about love, for instance, in marriage that were current pretty much up to the 20th century, and to help us see just how it really is, which ought to make it perhaps a little bit easier for us to deal with our own disappointments in relationships, for instance.
Yeah, that's a change in the 20th century to what we might call more realistic writing, and people more in touch with the dark side of life. Of course, we see that in so many areas, don't we? The arts reflect that. Many of our movies have sort of absurdist themes, and much of the painting of the 20th century recalls suffering to mind, and the great difficulties of finding any meaning in life. So it would seem as though the arts in general have gotten more in touch with the demonic side of human existence, and what we're calling here the face of human suffering. I was thinking in relationships, again, another side to it that is the subtle violence that can be involved. Maybe violence is too big a word. In one sense, we've got the terrible violence in our country where so many people get shot. We know that many of the murders really are happen within family circles or among friends, where there seems to be this moment of great anger and people lose their head and somebody gets shot or killed in one way or another. And so we know violence in that way, even within a structure where people know one another. But we also perhaps know a more subtle kind of violence, the kind of violence involved in manipulation and control. I think very often the feminist movement brings this to our mind, that the ways in which women end up being victims in the culture one way or another. And of course the minorities, of course, often experience that kind of exploitation. And then, some men in the culture would be feeling the opposite kind of problem, that there's a sort of subtle violence in expecting men always to be strong or macho, or to react somehow to what the feminist movement is saying, that men can feel their own put-downs as well and their own expectations that one can't live up to. I think you were recalling Bishop Huffman's sermon on Holy Thursday, where he was talking about the expectations that people put upon the priests, for example, putting priests on pedestals or expecting more from them than they could ever deliver. And maybe, I don't know if the word violence is so good to use in relationship to all of that, but it's a way, I guess, of saying strongly that very often mutuality doesn't exist, that there isn't simply care and concern in our human relationships, but a lot of times there's this subtle attempt to maneuver or control or to form somebody else in our own image. I think very often in that perspective we would say we end up loving our own projection, really, of what somebody is, instead of allowing them to be themselves. Perhaps we have in all of the business of stereotyping a little bit of violence. We want to push somebody and force them, stuff them into a particular category. So we talk about the Procrustean bed. So we can do that in human relationships, where someone is forced into a particular mold or fit into a particular size or shape.
I think the word violence is very appropriate. Probably in another time we would talk about crushing someone's spirit, and we usually probably do that by degrees. we put them down, or we don't somehow affirm what is good in them, and eventually they tend to walk around looking defeated and done in one way or another. And very often they have not been the victim of physical violence, but it has been this more subtle, perhaps verbal violence or psychological violence that we do in fact impose on one another.
I wonder if that comes very often, too, maybe just from silence or from not affirming the others. That crushing of the spirit it's such a delicate thing, the human spirit. You think sometimes when you've just done something, you don't know if it's good or bad, and someone will take the trouble and come up and say, hey, that was really good. Boy, your spirit really feels good. And other times, maybe if somebody makes a harsh remark at one of those delicate times, it just all seems deflated. The human spirit seems fragile in many ways. So maybe sometimes we hurt the other person and cause suffering simply by our insensitivity, by failing to say the kind word or failing to show support when someone needs it, and not noticing the face that looks fatigued, and not noticing the person feeling more fragile than usual.
I think silence can be a form of cruelty, but unfortunately, because it's a nothing, it's not something, we can sort of get off the hook in terms of feeling guilty about not saying something, because we haven't done anything, we haven't said anything cruel or nasty, and therefore we can sort of feel that we're clean. And yet I do think there are times when silence is perhaps a very positive form of cruelty.
So I'm thinking about the classic definition of what evil is, that is the privation of good, that comes to us from Augustine and through Aquinas. And many people find a lot of problems with that definition of evil, the privation of something that's good or of a due perfection that ought to be there, because it misses the kind of thing that you just said, I think, the positive character of evil in our world. The human suffering has a reality about it. And not to do something may well produce a very strong reaction in somebody else that's very real to them. I may forget to say the kind word, but they might be hurting in spirit. Their whole psyche might be distorted for a period of time because they haven't gotten that affirmation. I think people sometimes will use silence as a weapon, too, won't they?
Right.
Well, I'm not going to talk. Well, that's common in our culture. You say, I'm not going to talk to you because you did this terrible thing, or we're going to pass in silence. What a terrible thing it is for people to be together or live together, interact, and not even to be able to achieve that civility of saying hello. But it is a common way, I guess, of punishing the other person. I'm not going to talk to you because you have hurt me in some way, and I will show you or get back at you.
I think there's a problem in our culture because we have tended to define moral evil as positive, wicked things we have done rather than as good things we have neglected to do. Rather than this other side of it, what should have been there that wasn't there, what should have been done that wasn't done, or said that wasn't said.
Yeah, and perhaps failing to see that lack of action really hurts. It produces something very positive in the other person, or very real to them. Not positive, I shouldn't say, but very real to them, which is a psychic hurt in one way or another. Pat, the fiction writers ought to help us here a little bit. I'm thinking of Joyce Carol Oates, well-known writer, so prolific, produced so many different books. One of them I'm thinking of is the book Them, which had set somewhere in the late 60s up in Detroit, and sort of gave one a whole feel for the subculture that was suffering, the minorities in Detroit, who were sort of seething beneath the surface of things. The title Them represents the fact that there's always other people over against us, that's them, they're over there. I don't have real communion with them. There's no real communication or interaction with them. And I think you could read that novel, Them, by Joyce Carol Oates, and get perhaps more of a feel of what the racial riots were in the late 60s than many other sociological studies, for example. She gives us a real feel for the violence that was beneath the surface and the seething anger that was just ready to break out. And the fact then that indeed things did explode. So maybe Joyce Carol Oates would be a good one to look at for a while on this whole question of failed relationships or disappointments, or the question how violence enters into human relationships.
Certainly she is. Joyce Carol Oates' fiction is very, very highly charged. Someone once said that she could not use language better in sort of creating a sense of an explosive atmosphere, that music explodes and that grins shatter and grease spatters. There are all of these active verbs, and And violence is at the core of most of her crises. Joyce Carol Oates is very concerned with the illusions that she feels Americans in particular tend to live in. Illusions, for instance, that the self is stable and can be identified, and the illusion that somehow the ego is in control of the self rather than the passions. Oates would certainly affirm that passion is the predominant moving force in all of our lives, and yet we like to cling to this myth that somehow our head is in control, that we take command with our mind rather than our feelings.
So she'd say that's one of the major problems then, that
Certainly.
the passions are out of control in a way, that we're really guided by all of that. I guess the extreme violence of the murders would sort of point to that, wouldn't it?
She in fact asks, what are we except passion, and how are we to survive when this passion breaks its dikes and flows out? And so we see in her, for instance, many in her characters, I should say, a lot of murder, a lot of physical abuse. We see a lot of people becoming deranged, going insane. And I think she would suggest that they go insane because they've been living with illusions. They have not been in touch with the reality that they represent. Or because they're trying to transcend their environment, and in the very process of attempting to transcend, they bring down upon themselves the violent hatred and hostility of those around them, and thereby their own ultimate destruction.
I think of some of the stuff that I've read by her, that short stories and so on, that point out this inability of people to communicate finally at some deeper level, that they're not able to somehow tell one another what is going on. You have this notion and feeling that people are talking at cross purposes, like they're not listening to one another. They can't really share this passion that they have. Because if she's right, if we're that programmed by our passions, we really are in trouble, aren't we? I mean, if there's no possibility of any rational control of the passions, and we're carried away so much, I can see why a lot of her writing would come out to be very pessimistic and heavy. And I'm not sure that I really agree with that, but I think what seems to me she's good at is portraying the potential problems in human relationships, showing us how suffering can take over there, how lack of communication can hurt, and how violence indeed can be part of our interaction.
I think Oates would see that imagination might be one outlet, but what happens is when her characters turn to some goal, some imaginative ideal, or some dream, and pursue that somehow they will tend to become out of touch with reality and go mad, or those around will be jealous or resent it and will somehow work to psychologically destroy them. So she does see us as capable of at least attempting this transcendence, but you're right in saying that ultimately she's very pessimistic, and she does feel that we in America have an obsession for using violence as a way out of all of our problems.
She really points us to that, doesn't she? And
Yes.
that's something that so many people are feeling with street crime, and people talking about being afraid to walk in the streets or ride public transportation. That certainly is a large problem for us. But again, I suppose we experience it right within our own families or friendships or at the work site, where, again, this more subtle kind of violence occurs. Doesn't it seem as though we really need to build some sort of a positive answer to this? I mean, if a lot of our suffering is built into human relationships, we have to talk about how we're going to improve those. And again, from a theological perspective, I think we start out with the notion that all the people we interact with are filled with God's Spirit, that we are all sons or daughters of the great God, and that Jesus Christ has died for all of us, and that gives us a great dignity, that our sense is that God has communicated himself to us, and that we're temples of the Spirit. He lives within us, and that creates a bonding, really, among all human beings. There's an essential solidarity that we have, and that really one of the things we have to do is to reverence that or respect it. I often think of that phrase, we shouldn't at least increase the pool of suffering. I think sometimes when I'm counseling families and so on, and everybody's at each other's throat, and there's nothing but problems. That phrase comes, at least let's not increase the pool of suffering here. There's enough suffering in the world built in through disease and the large catastrophes of life and our own disappointments with ourself when we don't live up to our ideals. But why do we have to increase it? There's so much hurt as there is. So maybe the positive way of saying that, I suppose, is that the Christian message that we're supposed to be loving people, that we're supposed to exercise this concern, that we're trying to spot the needs around us, concrete needs, and to try to help the people who are hurting. Always strikes me as one of the things that's good about the ministry, in a sense, that we're sort of forced to do that in a way, or at least there's great opportunity to do that, where people present themselves with some sort of suffering and that we're called upon to help in some way. But that ministry is something that all religious people ought to be involved in. One of the things we're always pushing in the Catholic community these days is that our common responsibility to share the message, not just in word but in action, by living out this great law of love.
I think that probably Oates would not give as explicitly religious a response to the problem of suffering and violence and evil and passions gone wild as you have given, Jim, but I think what she might say is that these experiences, these volatile and intense experiences, can be routes of transcendence, that somehow through them we can move beyond perhaps the ordinariness of our experience. We can stretch and test our own mettle, and that somehow we can end up being better. I think this is the most optimistic response that she might give.
And what we would like to do, of course, in the Christian tradition is, and as a theologian, is to take that and say, good, we appreciate any positive light that can be thrown on the problem of evil in our culture, and we sort of take it wherever we can get it and see that really as a working of the Spirit, so that when the fiction writers come up with a positive answer to the human suffering that we all have to encounter and endure, that we're grateful for that we see that as a working of the Spirit as well. But what we say is we can go further, we can make it more explicit, that we have a name to put on it, that we say that's the workings of God's grace in our world. And we say that redemption is available for us, that the Lord has made healing possible through his death and resurrection, that there's blessing and gift available for all of us humans. All we have to do is tap it, that Christ has become life-giving Spirit for us and pours that out and energizes us, makes possible healing in human relationships. So I think that's the kind of language that we would adopt and try to use to explain these flickers of hope that occur in human relationships, and maybe the surprising energy we sometimes feel to make them work.
I think probably in a writer like Joyce Carol Oates, whose own philosophy or theology seems somehow to get to be too obscure to articulate if you look at all of the things that she has written, the best that we can perhaps hope for is that she will honestly and as realistically as possible delineate for us the human predicament, the human situation, and not pass judgments. And at least she does seem to lead us into some sort of sympathetic view of those who are either suffering or inflicting the violence on others. At least we are led to help understand how it could be that this character might become violent or might be responding in this particular unhealthy way to the violence that's being imposed.
Pat, that seems like a really good point to me, and one of the practical spin-offs of that seems to me to be in touch with that kind of fiction writing is that it liberates us a bit, to be in touch with our own angers, our own potential to violence, maybe to be more honest about our own attempts to manipulate and control, and the ways that we can subtly try to force people into stereotypical reactions and so on. And to be more in touch with that, I think, immediately turns us back then to our religious tradition and says, where is there strength for me? Where is there healing? How do I set aside my tendency to be violent and to hurt others? And how can I be more sensitive to others? And of course, what we say in the Christian tradition is, there we have the example of Jesus Christ. He presents the face of God to us, encountering the face of suffering. He's the one who was able to deal with suffering in a constructive way. He's the one who reached out and touched those who were sick. He's the one who spoke the sensitive word to people who were hurting. He's the one who spoke the challenging word to those who were involved in destructive behavior. And so I think as such, he really points out to us a way of living, a kind of interaction in which we say, hey, I want you to be your better self. I want to be attentive to your needs. I want you to grow and develop in whatever way you want to do it. And this would, I think, then make concrete that law of love that he taught us. That's the way we would share in it, by trying to meet the needs of the people around us. And in that way, I think the great God gets revealed. That's how we learn what it means to say that God is love, precisely because we experience it in our human relationships. And so the face of evil is real to us, and yet it is possible to overcome it.